Well, welcome to today's webinar in the Knowledge Miles series, part of the Lord Mayor's Lectures on behalf of Professor Michael Manelli, whose theme for his mayoral year is Connect to Prosper. In this free online lecture series, we address the connections in and around the square mile and how these might help us to tackle future challenges. You may notice that I'm not Tim Connell, who was down to chair this session. Tim, I'm afraid, has been detained, having to do a hospital visit with his wife. And so I'm Mike Wardle. I'm the Chief Executive at CN, and I'll be your convener for today's lecture. The plan for today is very simple. After my very brief introduction and housekeeping, we will get on to hearing from our main presenter today, John Warne, and then we'll have time for Q&A towards the end of the session. If you haven't used the GoToWebinar system before and you want to ask a question or make an observation, you'll find a question tab on your screen. You can type in your question or your observation. That'll come to us, and we'll field that during the Q&A at the end. And please, you do put in your question at any point during the presentation, so don't lose the thought. If it comes to you, please do put it in. We will pass on contact details for people who ask questions to John after the session, so if there's any need for further discussion or correspondence, that can be facilitated. The session's being recorded today, so if you want to go back and listen again, or if you have friends and colleagues who you think might be interested in watching the session, the recording will be up and posted on our website in the next 24 hours or so, and that's really is available for spreading the word and getting John's thoughts out into a wider audience. But it's a great pleasure to introduce John Warne, from the CEO at the Chartered Institute of Linguists, to address this question of why languages are for everyone, embracing our multilingualism. And John, have you always been involved in languages and language development, or is this something which is more recent?
Well, quite varied exposure to languages. I mean, the main experience I had was in the 1990s, living and working in France. So that was my sort of anchor experience. But I also worked in South America, so exposure to Spanish, Southeast Asia, and then worked in a variety of different contexts, always with languages as a golden thread, which is why I'm delighted to be at the Chartered Institute of Linguists.
Well, thank you very much. We're really looking forward to your lecture this morning. And so, yes, please tell us more about multilingualism and what we need to know.
Perfect. So hopefully you can safely see my slides.
All good. Thank you, John.
Excellent. So my name is John Warne, and I'm Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Linguists, as Mike says. I was Director of Strategy for the British Council, the UK's international organisation for educational and cultural relations, for some time. I've worked in international businesses, UK government, and in major UK universities. And as I mentioned, I've lived and worked in Europe, Southeast Asia, and South America. Graduate of Oxford, and professional working level French, improving Italian, some Spanish, and at the moment I'm learning Japanese and Mandarin Chinese and brushing up my German as I'm hoping to see some football next week. So languages absolutely at the core of where I spend my time. In terms of the Chartered Institute of Linguists, we're the UK's royal charter body for language professionals and linguists. So we provide qualifications of membership for translators, interpreters, and other linguists. And we seek to enhance and promote languages and professional language skills around the world. And we've been representing and supporting linguists as a profession since 1910. We have around 5,000 members in over 100 countries, and we have 100 different languages in our midst. So most of our members have a very good command of 2 or more languages, usually English and at least one other language. And this, as we'll see, I think in the presentation, makes them special, but not necessarily rare, in fact. So today, I'm here to talk about a topic that's close to many people's hearts, the joys and frustrations of language learning. And as we go through life, we often find ourselves regretting not continuing with or keeping up the languages that we learnt at school or at home or at university. And it's a bit like not keeping up with music lessons and the other great starts that we might have had in life but didn't continue. And despite all of this, many people who have achieved in the past a good standard in languages still shy away from using them at work. And in this talk, I want to explore why there is real value for people and their employers in using and improving their languages, not least because in today's world, with the wide range of apps, online resources, and language teaching tools available, language learning has never been more accessible for anybody at any age. But first, the bad news. So, as many of you will realize, learning languages to a good standard is not an easy thing. In fact, it takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours to learn a language, and there's no escaping this fact. But the good news is that absent a specific language-based learning disability, everyone who is exposed to hundreds and hundreds of hours of language will learn it. So, as with many things in life, there's a tendency early on to identify languages as something that we're either good at or not good at, rather than more simply as something we've had hundreds of hours of practice at or exposure to or not. And this is a little bit like the key insight from Malcolm Gladwell's often repeated, often misquoted, but very memorable 10,000 hours thesis, that mastery of anything both requires and to some extent can be achieved in 10,000 hours. So this is not to say that there aren't some people who seem to have a natural affinity for languages and impressive capabilities in learning them. There are people who have that. But as I know from my own organisation and my own experience, many linguists have had the good fortune to have either had bilingual or multilingual upbringing, either through family circumstances or the simple facts of geography, and that can often be the biggest explanation of why people have excellent languages. So indeed, on a worldwide scale, when we look at the numbers, there are more people who are functionally bilingual, 43%, than people who are monolingual. And I remember, for example, interviewing someone for the Linguist, our in-house magazine, some while ago, who described crossing one Dutch border to buy things in German in the morning and another border to buy something else in French in the afternoon to get the best prices on cigarettes and wine for his grandfather. So languages are absolutely everywhere in his early life. And if you meet people from Switzerland, commonly they'll have multiple languages as well. So some of this is just a product of where you live, how close to borders you live, and the environment you grew up in. But for people who don't have the good fortune to have grown up with languages in their lives, certainly was the case for me as a youngster, for example, there's only really two routes to becoming a linguist. One is to fall in love with languages at school, or the other is to be lucky enough to travel to or live and work in another country. So I have to say schoolboy French certainly didn't push my buttons, but living and working in France later on in my life did. And that changed my beliefs about whether I could do languages, and it gave me the practical skills to live and work in French and in France, of course. So I worked in France for 5 years. So by my calculation, that's probably a minimum exposure of around about 10,000 hours of French in a professional working context. So following Gladwell, I really have no excuse not to speak decent French after 10,000 hours, let alone the thousands of other hours I spent exposed to social French. So indeed, allowing for sleep, I probably clocked up nearly 30,000 hours of exposure to French in total. So how many hours of exposure does a typical UK school pupil get? Well, a typical UK secondary school language learner today might be exposed to 450 hours of language at best. So that would be about 90 hours a year for 5 years, and many would get much less than that. And of course, if an increasing proportion, don't continue with study at all. So, as a very good article in The Conversation pointed out recently, young people in Britain aren't bad at learning languages, but the school system certainly doesn't make it easy for them. So, all of this means that the average school-taught British person, if they feel confident enough to speak any words at all in another language, will generally readily accept the conversation being flipped into English if they meet someone who speaks another language. And the higher number of hours that are dedicated to teaching English in many international school systems, and of course the pervasive presence of English in so much creative, cultural and audiovisual content, means that an interlocutor's English is very likely to be better than a British person's command of their language. And we can return to this later in the Q&A in the list of reasons why monolingual English speakers tend to give up on languages, but really shouldn't. So the moral of this story is, if by some miracle you have been exposed to hundreds or even better, thousands of hours of a language, then that really is a priceless gift. And if you are bilingual, multilingual, or have lived in another country and you have that skill, then that is something that other people would have to spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours to match. So why wouldn't you prize it, value it, and shout about it? Well, one of the reasons is the tyranny of fluency. So far too many people in English-speaking countries believe that unless they are fluent in another language, it's not worth having or using it at all. And this, I believe, is the single biggest obstacle to progress with languages in Anglophone countries. If you combine the hundreds of hours problem with the I don't use it unless I'm fluent problem, then you get what we have, which is far too many people with perfectly usable language skills that just don't practice, develop, and use them enough. So just to bring this into sharper focus, let's take a brief look at language levels, how long they typically take to achieve, and then what you can do with them. So the main international benchmark for languages is the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, or the CEFR. And this was promulgated by the Council of Europe for well over 30 years now. And the CEFR starts with A1 and A2, which are the beginner levels, B1 and B2, which are titled independent because they give you, in effect, functional independence to get by and get things done in another language. And then finally, there's C1 and C2, which are the levels of proficiency and mastery, which would indicate you can work confidently and professionally in a language. So let's just take a little look at how long it would take you to progress up each rung of the CEFR ladder. Well, with tuition, support, and self-study, a motivated learner might need, let's say, 150 hours to get to A1, and another 150 to get to A2. So that's the first onset of being able to get by in a language. It might then take another 200 hours to get to B1, which is beyond paddling and starting into swimming in a language, and then maybe another 250 hours to get up to B2, the onset of really useful working level proficiency and self-confidence. Leveling up to C1, which is the minimum standard for linguists, diplomats, and people like that, that would cost you at least another 250 hours. So, simply put, for most people, it's a good 1,000 hours of tuition and focused self-study to get to anything resembling fluent by most language experts' estimation. But, and this is the good news, there is absolutely nothing stopping almost any one of us achieving this if we put in the hours. So, what difference does it make, and why would you bother? Well, quite simply, I would say it makes all the difference in the world. So you can see the descriptors of what the different levels enable you to do. But in simple terms, I would ask you, is it worth several hundred hours of learning to have a sufficient range of language to be able to give a clear description and express viewpoints on most general topics in a language? Well, I would say so. And that's where I'm heading with my Italian at the moment, moving on from basic sentences with memorized phrases, which is the lower level, to enough language to get by with sufficient vocabulary to express myself. And that means family holidays, that means being able to talk with colleagues, and that means really starting to enjoy an independent life with a language. So moving from being a tongue-tied beginner to the bottom rung of being independent feels like all the difference in the world. But I suppose the question is, how is a person with a busy life to get these hundreds of hours? Well, first, if you already have hundreds of hours of language in your memory banks, then please bring them out of storage and start investing in more hours to add to the balance. If you grew up with a language or you learned one at school, it will come back quite quickly if you practice it, and it is useful at whatever language you have it, whatever level rather you have it. And when you translate a language's value into those hundreds of hours it costs to learn or would cost a beginner, you start to see how valuable your languages actually are. The second step is to improve your languages, and many universities offer excellent evening classes, and the important thing is they offer them to the general public from absolute beginner level upwards, so they're not restricted only to students of the institution. So I used to work at King's College London, for example, which has a fantastic modern languages centre which welcomes all comers at all standards, and that's the case in major universities all around the country. The great majority of them will have a modern languages centre. And then there are, of course, the apps. I have an uninterrupted 4 and a bit year streak on Duolingo, so I think it's over 1,500 days for French and Italian. So that means that I do probably 10 to 15 minutes twice a day of French and Italian, with a bit of Japanese and Chinese added in the last year or so. And I've dabbled in 8 other languages on Duolingo, so I have bits and pieces of Dutch, German, etc. Memrise, which is another excellent app which uses a flashcard approach, is also excellent for picking up language, particularly good if you're about to go on a holiday. So with all the hype around AI and all the angst about what digital technologies might be doing to us all, one hesitates to say something wholly positive about technology. But I have to say that the potential and indeed today's reality of digital language learning is one of the most exciting possibilities to help the next generation of linguists fall in love with languages, and indeed to help people of all ages improve and restore their own languages. And I would stress that apps can absolutely restore a language which has got a bit rusty and help people with some existing language skills progress to more and more useful levels. So speaking again from personal experience, I learned my Italian entirely via Memrise and then Duolingo, and I recovered my self-confidence in professional French by practicing it again on Duolingo. So why bother with languages? I'll keep this brief as the arguments I think are well known to all of us. Languages have far-reaching benefits both for individuals and their employers. In a globalized world, the ability to communicate effectively across cultures and languages has to be a valuable asset. It opens up new opportunities for personal and professional growth, fosters cultural understanding, and enhances one's overall perspective on life. Indeed, as AI automates the routine, more and more the most valuable bring of any human being will be the deeply human skills, the human connection, and languages, of course, are the most deeply human skill of them all. Plus, you avoid the perils of boring old monolingualism. In short, monolingualism limits your understanding of other cultures and peoples, and to be honest, gives you a lack of perspective on your own. So avoiding monolingualism has to be a good thing. So finally, and also very briefly, the Chartered Institute of Linguists recognises the importance of language skills in the workplace, and we promote the use of international language frameworks like the CEFR, which I mentioned earlier. And we've started offering very straightforward CEFR-based language level assessments in a very wide range of languages, 40 plus at least, and we'll have a go at assessing you in pretty much any language. We had someone achieve C2, which is the highest level of attainment you can have, in Yiddish just the other week. So these assessments are accessible, they're user-friendly, they're delivered online in less than an hour, and you basically have a conversation with an expert languages assessor who will talk to you, assess your spoken level, and then once you've been assessed, you'll get a certificate of attainment which shows your current CEFR level. And by taking advantage of both the CEFR framework and language level assessments and things like them, individuals can get a clearer understanding of their current language abilities and then importantly can communicate them effectively to their employers. Employers in turn can get a better recognition and understanding of the language skills in their workforce and can start to leverage them to enhance their international reach and competitiveness. As an employer, I would say if you have people with B1 and B2, that's the independent level skills in your midst, then I think you should know about them. And people with C1 proficiency should be clearly identified in any HR system as having a very valuable asset. Skills at this level are genuinely valuable business assets and can make a difference. So the first thing for organizations is to know what's in their midst. So to sum up, for knowledge workers in the city and the many international businesses that connect the square mile with the four corners of the globe, then obviously the international reach of English is undoubtedly a huge asset. But in a place as diverse and interconnected as the City of London, the ability to speak other languages is invaluable. Even a few words in another person's language can generate appreciation and trust, as well as fostering a more inclusive and collaborative work environment. And I always like this poster, which I took a photo of when I was in a Beijing university at a 1,000 person sitting with people taking their English tests. Quote from Nelson Mandela, which is, if you talk to a person in a language they understand, that goes to the head. If you talk to them in their own language, that goes to the heart. And I think that really sums up the basic value of having at least some language before engaging with international audiences. So as I've said, and I live myself on a daily basis, one of the most exciting aspects of language learning today is its accessibility. We can all quite easily put in the hours these days. So with language learning apps, online resources, virtual and physical university-based classrooms, anyone can start learning or improving a language at their own pace and their own convenience. These tools offer a wide range of learning styles and approaches, catering to different preferences and needs, whether you prefer interactive lessons, more gamified app approaches, or immersive conversations with AI or with native speakers, there is a language learning resource out there for you. It doesn't really matter where you get your hundreds of hours. All that matters is that you do. And you can practice a language during your commute, on a lunch break, or even while waiting for the kettle to boil, as I do personally. The social, economic, and cultural value of languages can be a constant source of personal and professional growth in your career and throughout your life. And by valuing languages at all levels of proficiency, we really can encourage more people to embrace the joy and benefits of learning, speaking, improving, and using their languages. So please never, ever give up on languages. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. A really good overview of the challenge of language, but also the value of language. I've got a question. First of all, we're going to start off with Isabel Freitas asking how you see AI in translation and proofreading. Is it a problem, or is it a useful tool to help translation and
Well,
translators?
look, I mean, there's a lot we could say about that. I could go on for hours on that topic, but the essential issue is that I think certainly at this stage in its technological development, and I suspect for a very long time to come, you absolutely must have a human translator at the heart of any significant or high stakes translation. The scale of errors that you see in the use of translation software, particularly when people are using more vanilla tools like generative AI, is really quite high. And there's an enormous skew in our understanding of AI, which is caused by the fact that all of the training data used for AI, or most of the training data used for AI, tends to privilege the English language. So what you don't see, or what people who are monolingual English speakers don't see, is just how scratchy AI is in other languages. So, the short answer to your question is we would always advocate for a human translator for any important or significant piece of translation work. The cost to businesses of using AI without checking can be enormous in terms of the mistakes that creep in. And really, although I'm very positive about AI more generally and particularly for language learning, I would be very, very reluctant to recommend it as a complete solution for any form of translation. You need a human being at the heart of translation.
I know personally someone who is a literary translator from Spanish and Portuguese who is horrified at some of the uses she's seen of AI in translation because choosing the right word has been her life.
Well, I think the important thing to recognize, as we all know, is that AI doesn't understand meaning and doesn't have a causal understanding of what it's producing. It is entirely based on algorithmic correlation. So if there's a strong correlation in the training data between two things, it will serve up that as the answer. And the classic case of this, particularly with neural networks, which are complicated and layer different levels of complexity on top of each other, is that there are ghosts in the machine that the people running an AI just can't predict. So we all know about the concepts of hallucination, that AI can just give you something that is plainly false and assert it with absolute confidence. Well, even in the most sophisticated translation data sets, you find ghosts in the machine. So there's a perfect example that we were looking at from the University of Vienna, which is a translation of soy sauce. So soy sauce, the Chinese condiment, which was translated into French, and on the ingredients label, it's down as "I am sauce." And basically, what the AI has done is it has dug out the word soy from Spanish, translated it to "I am," and then transposed it into the French and added it to an ingredients label. So you now have "I am sauce," or "I am" instead of soy. And these sorts of things are the kind of deep correlations that you have in AI training data, which means even the best of them need some sort of oversight. And as I say, the issues with languages further away from English just multiply. So it's important. It's an important tool to have. Many translators will use it to help them in their work, but I don't think anyone should rely on it 100%.
Well, thank you very much. Hugh Persers asked about the importance of learning to read and write other languages as well as speak and listen. especially those using different scripts. And where does the process of reading and writing fit into learning?
I mean, undoubtedly, the all four skills are valuable. I suppose I have a slight skew towards advocating for speaking, because I do think that speaking is the one that sometimes escapes people in this country. So what you'll find very commonly with people who exit a UK university with a languages degree is that they will be pretty strong on reading and writing, but often not confident to speak. So I think that's one of the reasons why I'm keen to sort of push the speaking agenda. I just think that it's tragic that so many people have the groundings but don't use them. But of course, in terms of understanding how languages work, delighting in the joy of a turn of phrase, reading and writing, absolutely, central to that. I just think that the act of speech is so important to encourage because it's the one that most people have a cringe factor on.
Thank you very much. Eleanor de Benedetto has asked just if you could comment on the return on investment for learning a language. She comments that many people end up not using their language skills in their careers, excluding people who are translators or interpreters. Language-focused jobs are few and far between and normally focus on research-heavy, quite junior roles. In other words, is there a return on the time and investment that you might spend?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable challenge, and is in the list of reasons, perfectly valid reasons why um, people who have English and who live in an English-speaking country sometimes struggle to persuade themselves that languages are worth the endeavor, because question number one is which language, because there are so many others to choose, whereas in many other countries the default is English. Of course you would go for English because of its global prevalence. And then, as we say, a number of, or the great majority of employers will not be sophisticated in understanding or seeking out languages in their midst. So I think you've really got to make a personal case for this around the personal value in terms of your own possibilities and your own capabilities that justify the hundreds of hours. So I think all too often we pin it on the school system, the university system, businesses, or somebody else who needs to do this. Fundamentally, if you want to get somewhere in languages, it's you, the individual, who needs to do something about it. And it is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, but there are few things in life which deliver a greater sense of achievement and joy than actually being able to converse with someone in another language. So I think what I would advocate for here is bringing it back to the individual and inviting individuals. Probably with English, I think there may be more of a case for picking up a bit of a number of languages. Certainly, that's my approach to have a bit of a lot of languages, because likely you are in professional circumstances to be flipped into English and conduct business in English. But I do think that the personal value and the personal investment in languages is always worth it. I mean, it is the quintessential human skill.
Thank you for that. Tim Connell has joined the call. He's back from doing other things, and has
Right.
asked what can clients and end users expect from a professional translator or interpreter? What does that bring, and how do you know that someone is properly skilled?
Well, properly skilled. I think you're looking for qualified and ideally accredited with an organisation like ours, or the Institute of Translation Interpreters, also very good Association of Translation Companies. So I think you want to see someone who's qualified and accredited before you would use them. And what's the difference that they bring? Well, I guess all the difference in the world. Because in essence, as we were saying, the risk with using translation tools, is very, very significant errors. And here we're talking about errors which we in the jargon refer to as fatal errors, which would totally undermine the understanding of a reader, or alternatively, and particularly in a business context, could undermine the contractual or negotiation value of a piece of text, or lose you the sale in a marketing context. So I think the nuance, the appreciation of context, the appreciation of meaning are the central things that a translator brings, and then the things to look out for are qualifications and accreditation.
Going back to the question of monolingualism and the
Mm-hmm.
fact that we are drawn quite often in international conversations into English because it is a common language for much of business. Particularly a lot of my work is done in finance, and having enough English-speaking people is actually one of the key determinants of how well a overseas financial centre is able to operate in English. But how far is that something which has simply overpowered our culture's willingness to learn other languages? Do you think?
Look, I think we have to have some sympathy and some empathy for ourselves. It is a very, very difficult task for someone who has grown up learning English in the modern world to bridge out and learn other languages. It's a very, very difficult thing because English is all pervasive. As we say, you'll be flipped into English in many working contexts. And English is a default, not it's a default language of business. So all of the incentives are stacked against you. All the more reason, therefore, to value, prize, and cherish anyone who has, either through luck, through family upbringing, or through hard work, managed to develop some sort of useful level in other languages. So I think I would make the case, and this is why sounds a bit dry and boring to talk about language level frameworks, but I do think they're surprisingly important because I think in monolingual English speaking cultures, you have the sense that there are only, two levels of language, fluent and can't speak it. When in actual fact, there are, all different grades of linguistic ability and they're all useful. And I think, when you reflect on obviously in a major global city where English is the language of business, you may not have significant opportunities in the kind of flagship moments to use your languages. But in the margins of meetings, around the edges of meetings, and the relationships that you build, they're all aided by some linguistic ability in another language. They're all the soft skills, all the soft relationships are enormously enhanced if you have some words or ideally some fluency, some capability in the other languages. So I think the first thing I would say, compassion for ourselves. We do have it, we do have it hard, and then valuing what we have. And I think instead, what we tend to do is very, very hard on ourselves and say, it's some sort of either national problem or that we're all in some way inferior in our ability to learn languages. We're not. We're just exposed to languages in a different way than people are in other cultures.
Thank you very much. And I just wondered whether you had any insight into which languages or what the shift has been between which languages people study in the UK. Growing up, everyone that I knew did schoolboy French, as most people did. Some people were very daring and did some German alongside it, but that was about it. Unless you got to A level and did sort of something exotic like Russian or Spanish. But what are the trends in language learning that you might be able to see from your position?
Well, certainly in the school system, probably the biggest shift would be, well, the biggest shift overall is decline. So that's the first thing to say that, we have declining numbers and that's a problem. The second thing would be the rise of Spanish. So Spanish now, I think it's true to say, pips French as the number one language in schools. So basically, you have Spanish and French quite large, German much smaller. Although there is a significant investment going into to German at the moment, and you could be, I think we could be more optimistic for the future. There is quite a significant investment going into school level languages at the moment. I think probably the thing which would make me the most optimistic is the increasing recognition and the increasing number of contexts in which people talk about home, heritage, and community languages. So the recognition that many people in the school system are actually bringing into school Polish, Urdu, Mandarin, Cantonese, all sorts of other languages that they've picked up in other contexts. And I do think, and I'm sure Tim would agree, that one of the great opportunities that we have as a country is to embrace the linguistic diversity in our midst and to try to get that more readily recognized in the school and education system. So I think you're starting to see that somewhat with Arabic. Arabic is becoming much more recognized. The other home community and heritage languages a bit less so, but I do think that the dialogue and the discourse has changed amongst learned societies and educationalists, and a much greater recognition of the value of home community and heritage.
I've got a question from one of my colleagues, Jacopo, who's asked you to comment on what the advantages are of studying sort of the dead languages, Latin or ancient Greek. Is it to train your brain, or is it to just be aware of the cultural heritage that comes from the past?
Well, the first thing to say is that we stand on the shoulders of those languages, in effect. So there's significant swathes of Latin and Greek in modern languages, certainly European languages. The second thing to say is that some awareness of linguistics and learning, so-called dead languages or ancient languages gives you this appreciation of linguistics. There's a really strong case for some appreciation of linguistics, because what it actually does is gives you greater resilience. So there's a tendency, along with fluent or bust, to focus on errors. And one of the most discouraging things in the school system is in most subjects you don't get your homework sent back to you covered in red pen, whereas in languages it's absolutely strewn with red pen. So there's a tendency to focus on all the things that you got wrong. I think if you study Latin, Greek, linguistics, or indeed, any other language, what you start to realize is that languages have all sorts of interesting differences and all sorts of different ways of doing the same sorts of things. And once you realize that, languages do have these differences, you become a bit more forgiving of yourself, not getting the grave accent correct on the E, or, missing off the cedilla. So you realize that actually, it's not surprising that an English speaker will make common and repetitive errors in certain languages, because our language is structured differently. So I think that's one of the benefits. It gives you greater resilience, and there is evidence that people who've had some exposure to linguistics, ancient languages, and understand how languages work at a meta level tend to persist longer and perform better in school languages. So it actually helps people with perseverance and resilience, because they become less obsessed with small mistakes.
Despite, of course, the joy of reading Virgil in the original Latin, or having access to original literature, whichever language you're reading. And Tim Gulcher has noted that given communication advancements, are English dialects converging, do we think, or are they diverging given the great diversity of spoken English across the world? And do you see a future where English itself might split into multiple languages, or separates into something different?
It's a very good question. I mean, the thing is with languages that there are always two competing forces with languages, in any linguistic context. There's intelligibility, which tends to make languages converge, and then there's differentiation, which is to do with identity and showing that I'm different from you, so I can identify my group versus your group. And those are the constant pressures in languages, which are driving their endless change. So I think if you look at the data, what you'll see in the UK is that there has been some convergence in dialects. Certainly over the last 50, 60 years, they've kind of clustered into larger groups. So there's a more sort of generic north, more generic south, more generic west, and the sort of very specific micro dialects have started to merge when you look at younger people's languages. But then, if you look at it on a global scale, what you can see is that in no way does the UK own English. There are all sorts of different Englishes around the world. I mean, most obviously American English, but also Australasian English. And then there's a thing that when I was at the British Council, we used to refer to as English 2.0, which is international English, which is a kind of a stripped down version of English, which non-native speakers of English commonly use. And indeed, one of the things, to your point, Mike, earlier about business meetings in a finance setting, is very often when the native English speaker arrives in the room, they sort of change the character of the English that's being spoken. If there isn't a native English speaker in the room, everybody else is speaking English 2.0, which has slightly different grammar and a simplified structure, and they're all getting along very happily. Actually, the English speaker arriving in the room, or the native English speaker, tends to stymie the conversation. So you've got these interesting forces around convergence, mutual intelligibility, and then differentiation. And interestingly enough, it will be interesting to see how this changes over time. But the main drivers of differentiation in languages are teenage girls. So if you look at what drives linguistic change, it's the habits, new vocabulary, and new ways of describing things that teenage girls generate, which are disproportionately the driver of language drift. So if you want to know what we'll be saying next in English, then go and interview teenage girls in various countries, and you'll get a sense of where the language is going, because they're the big bringers of linguistic change.
It's like the Taylor Swift factor, I think, is therefore probably quite important.
Absolutely, they're the innovators, teenage girls.
I've got time for one last question before we close. Isabel Freitas has come back to ask whether you think that translators need to specialize in one or more field of knowledge, having in mind market exigencies. So, is there a trend, and is that the right trend, that you specialize in a particular field?
I think there are all sorts of ways to have a successful career in translation, but certainly many people say that finding their niche has been quite a valuable part of their development as a translator. So that's about I suppose finding something that you really enjoy, you're really good at, so you have those benefits, because we all tend to perform better in something that we are really interested in and really enjoy. So there's that benefit, but also I think there is evidence of being better paid and commanding higher fees when you have specialised and been successful in a niche, because you're more likely to encounter specialised vocabulary, you're more likely to encounter nuance and shades of meaning, and you're probably more likely to encounter direct clients who will come to value the thing that you bring, and will therefore be much happier to pay you appropriately for it. Whereas if you're in a kind of a word mill context of translation, then it's harder to differentiate oneself and form those relationships with direct clients. So I think there's a lot to be said for finding a niche and finding a specialization in terms of your own enjoyment of the work, but also in terms of understanding and being valued by your clients.
Well, thank you very much. A final comment from Tim Connell, just talking about heritage languages. Agrees absolutely they're worthwhile, but written and reading skills, he said, are often under a practical level. It's sort of difficult to maintain those. We have reached the end of our time, I'm afraid. So just to look ahead, we have some exciting lectures coming up in the lecture series. On Wednesday, the 19th of June, Seeing is Believing, the Miracle of Modern Eye Healthcare. On the 26th of June, Maths for All, the Importance of Maths Literacy, so following on from language literacy. And on Thursday, the 27th of June, a session on the waste of space, the problem with space debris, and the challenges and opportunities associated with solving it. So plenty of good content to come up. But thanks to you, the audience, for your interest and for supporting the Lord Mayor's lectures, and for your engagement in this session. It's always great to see you at these sessions and to hear from you. And of course, thank you to you, John Warne. We're really grateful for your insights today, and the challenge for everyone is to brush up their language skills or decide to take on something new. We might have to reconvene in a year's time and see how much progress we've made. The lecture, as I mentioned before, are recorded and posted on the Gresham Society website and on our YouTube channel in case you'd like to revisit. We hope to see you all again for another lecture in the Knowledge Miles series, and don't forget the Lord Mayor's theme for the year, Connect to Prosper. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon, and goodbye.